Our first speaker is Max Wolff, an economist teaching presently at the New School. He has a blog on the Huffington Post and a list of attributes that he gave me as we were driving over that I did not write down, so maybe you can say some of them himself. He's been involved with Occupy in the formative stage in New York. He's been to Oakland and to London. And without further ado,
Thanks for having me. With all these things, it's always the only real audience that matters to you is your decision about what you got and what you didn't get that matters. So the rest of whatever I've wasted what was once my youth on accomplishment-wise is probably not enormously important. What might be relevant is I've been in this space, so I've been a consultant both to major banks in the space on the housing lending, on structured financial products. So I think for someone who'd come to these kind of events, which I do, I'd be sort of unusual in that I know the other side of the transaction. So I was a consultant in making these sausages that you're now trying to figure out how to get people to no longer consume, but with E. coli in some of the meat. So I've been on both sides of that transaction, which might be unusual. I teach in the graduate program for international affairs at the New School. As you heard, that's true. I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson's economist. I've worked with him for the last 4 years. I've been a consultant to the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus, sort of usual alphabet soup of pro bono, not-for-profit lobby groups in DC. I'm based in New York City, where I'm also a financial consultant. So I've been a consultant to a bunch of hedge funds in the space as well, and wrote a lot of stuff, got me in trouble, got me fired from my early industry jobs in 2006, 2007, so a lot of which appeared in the Asia Times or the Huffington Post, sort of going through a forecast of why I thought there was a housing crisis, why I thought there was going to be a housing crisis, how I thought that housing crisis was going to go. You can see my work pretty regularly at BBC, CNBC, Al Jazeera English, where I'm the financial markets commentator, Russia Today, where I'm the financial markets commentator, and California Public Radio, NPR, Marketplace. I get around. I try to pollute as much as I can the airways and public consciousness with a little bit of my logo feces, so I can get the next paid gig, which allows me to do some of the unpaid gigs, which are usually more fun. Okay? So you're in good hands to the extent that I've done this a lot of times. It's up to you to decide whether you're just the latest victim or if I have something to offer. So one of my area of specialties is I'm trained as an economist. I did my doctoral work in. That's what I'm paid to do at the New School, teach economics. I've been following this space for a long time, and what I think I can give you is two things. I'm going to start with an overview, because I can guess what you're interested in, but you actually know. And knowledge usually beats a guess. So I'm going to give you a big overview, and then I'm going to try to leave maximum time for Q&A until I can answer the specific questions you have. Just for humility's sake, to make everyone's time most well spent, I'm not an expert on the local circumstances. I don't know the local housing market here. You guys probably do. I don't. I don't know the local laws. They're a real rat's nest of difference from state to state, county to county. So I'm not the guy to give you the answer about what your house is really worth here, or whether or not you should walk away from it, or some interstice of a local regulatory battle about local housing, zoning, laws, rights. I simply don't know that stuff. There are probably lots of folks in the room who do, who have more experience, so I'm not going to be useful to you there. I like to get that out of the way, so I don't waste your time, and you're not waiting for an hour to ask me a burning life question that you need answered today, which I couldn't possibly answer for you. Okay? What do I do? Okay, well, I'm going to give you the view, the flyover, right? So I'm going to tell you that there are 4 pillars that created the housing crisis, all 4 of which are still in place, which is why our search for a solution, I put the search in quotation marks, and we can discuss the legitimacy and depth and creativity of that search, maybe in the Q&A, but our attempts, our search, both in terms of spending and in terms of policy suggestion, haven't addressed any of the 4 underlying causes of the foreclosure crisis, which is why we sit here on a sunny spring afternoon with about 2.4 million foreclosures under our collective belt, and with a foreclosure pipeline of between 4 and 6 million units, depending on where you come down on the estimates. And maybe the bigger story is just the numbers being so large, and we could discuss if you want, but it may not be the crux of your interest, why the foreclosure pipeline estimates vary so enormously, right? The bottom line is we know that we have had a bunch of structural breaks in our foreclosure issue, but that we still have a pipeline with at least twice as many units. I don't call them homes because it's apartments, condos, units, land, right? It's a little bit variable. But we have at least 4 million units in the pipeline. What does the pipeline mean? The pipeline means for us who do this stuff, model the stuff out, do forecasts, people who are more than 60 to 90 days delinquent in mortgage, we know they're not getting help, and so they generally have a hard time getting current again. We also know that folks who are sitting on a home that's significantly underwater, they owe at least 25% more than it's worth, are very likely to foreclose. If we get the combination of 60 plus days late in mortgage payments with 20% plus underwater, then we know there's a very good chance of foreclosure. The other things we look for are what are called the vintage years, what years the loans were issued. So 05, 06, 07 are our 3 weakest vintage years. We see mass foreclosure in loans made 04, 05, 06, 07, but 05, 06, 07 is the sour spot. I like to call it the sour spot. It's a much more likely loan to default. The other thing we're going to look for on what's the feeder stock for the foreclosure crisis are any kind of exotics. So what in the industry we used to call ninja loans, and you probably know from the media as liar loans. We call them ninja for no income, no job, or assets, NINJA. Yeah? The media picked this up as liar loans. And you might have also known them by their industry euphemism, low doc, low documentation loans, right? Low doc or no doc, low documentation, no documentation loans default at a very high rate. So we look for that. We also look for something called ARMs, which I'm happy to talk about, ARM or adjustable rate mortgages. And of course the suspect that you know probably from the media too, the subprime, where subprime just means a credit score average below 660. Doesn't tell us anything about the profile, particularly of the buyer in that case. Could be a young person, could be a person without medical insurance that's had a health incident, could be a person of color, could be inner city. They were more profitable to make, so they were often made to people who qualified for crime, but they have a very high foreclosure rate. What do I mean? About 24% of all subprime mortgages ever made are presently delinquent or in foreclosure. That's 1 in 4. Okay, in order to get the loans approved, when they went through regulatory process or were sold to investors at one point, the representation was made that less than 1% of these loans would default in any decade. And we have a 24% that hasn't been a decade, so I leave it to you to figure out how accurate that particular forecast was, right? So that's the foreclosure problem. What creates the foreclosure problem? 4 pillars, in my opinion. 1, the driving pillar that you hear less about, especially before the Occupy movement, which has brought more discussion, is that the real wages of the average middle-class person in the United States, real wages meaning what you actually get paid in dollars, what it says all the way to the right in the center of your check at your job, to the extent that you have a job, have not gone up in 35 years. So what you buy is going up in price faster or as fast as what you earn. Sort of treading to be American, the social glue, the social aspiration, the founding myth of the country, is growing consumption. So from the mid-1970s, when real wages stagnated, through 2008, where the credit opportunity exploded in the housing crisis, we saw the average middle, basically the lower 80% of the US population. So the first, second, third, fourth quintile, the bottom 80% of 4 out of 5 by income. We saw them borrow the difference between a stagnant income and rising consumption. So this wedge gets larger and larger. Here's your income going along flat if you're the bottom 80%, and here's your spending coming up. How do you accomplish that? You cut your savings and you borrow, right? The first things people like to borrow on were their credit cards, and we had various credit card debt explosion. So as we sit and talk with each other, $2.5 trillion is owed by Americans on their credit cards, all in, on revolving credit, right? So that's credit, auto, appliance loans. We saw the student loan debt blow out too. My project now, whether this makes you unhappy or not unhappy, is to redo the models I did in 2005 and 2006 on the housing market for student loan debt. It's the same model. It'll have more or less the same story, and it even has the same top-out boom pattern of debt spiking in 2010, 2011 that we saw that told some of us that the crisis was coming in housing. Same model. You have an arms race to go to college. It's unaffordable for the average middle-class person. They'll chase the dream anyway because it's definitional. You don't make it in America. You can't have a job without a house and a college degree. Even if you can't afford the house, you buy the house. That's your housing crisis. That's flat wages for 35 years and rising costs. Likewise, education, costs rising about 4 times the rate of wages since 1980. So it's 30 years of the price outstripping, and student loan debt just went through $1 trillion this year. So we had a big watermark. and it's now higher than standalone credit card debt, right? And that's official student loan debt. There's a whole universe of student loan debts that don't get counted that way because they look like parents' credit card bills. Or they look like parents borrowing money to renovate their home but don't renovate their home, they pay the kids' tuition, right? Or they look like a kid doing this or that, right? You have whole little industries playing on this right now, right? So now you have a growing cottage industry and getting young female college students who have very limited ability to pay for their debt to sell their eggs. It's a big business. And if you go to a tier 1 school, you'll see the ads everywhere. And it's creeping down because Ivy League eggs go to a premium over, tier 2 school eggs. SAT scores influence it. But it's a big business. So you see somebody who's figured this out, that you have a loan constraint, right? That's a nasty illustrative story. It's not a giant business. You won't see somebody going around with a hydrogen truck buying eggs in the corner next to the ice cream truck. But it gives you an idea of what's going on in the space. So stagnant wages, rising costs, right? Housing, the definitional cost, right? And when we talk about housing, we have to be careful to do the numbers. My job to some extent, but you have to remember that the numbers tell a little bit of a partial story, right? So to steal a good line from a much more illustrative speaker than me, from Mark Twain, statistics are history with the tears wiped dry. So I'm going to lean heavily on the history of what happened to housing, but I want to acknowledge that this is a story with the tears wiped dry. And given what a lot of you do, you probably are in the business of watching those tears flow and dabbing those tears and thinking about those tears. And I'm not trying to be insensitive to the human element. It's just not my particular area of expertise, right? But I hope to learn from you and your questions and comments more than I expect you'll learn from me on that front. What I do know is the structural economics and the finance. Stagnant wages for 35 years, rising home prices, right? How do people do this? Well, the way they basically do it is they borrow more money. Now, this is a group of people who borrowed out as much as they can on their car going into the recession in the late 90s. They've borrowed as much as they can on their credit card. So they go into this with $2.5 trillion in auto, appliance, and credit card debt. And the banks are getting nervous. The American middle class hasn't seen its wages rise in 35 years, but it wants to borrow more and more. To send the kid to school, they can't afford it anymore. To get medical care, they can't really afford it anymore, but the society relies on them to be able to afford it. And to buy a house, they can't really afford anymore. And to fix up the house, they can't afford it anymore. And to get the sub-zero fridge that they can't afford in the house they can't afford, or the nicer range, or the granite countertop. And the world economy, to no small extent, relies on U.S. consumer, right? 4.5% of the world's population resides in these United States. These United States are responsible for 22% of private consumption. So each American consumer is consuming for about 5 global citizens, which means if there's trouble with the American consumer, it quickly becomes global. Stagnant wages, rising debt, but rising fear. How can we keep loaning to these people? Their ability to pay us back is not rising, because your ability to pay back is ultimately set by your wages, right? If your wages are flat and you want to borrow more, you're going to be a tough person to loan to, right? And everybody knows that, and they're pesky economists. They only keep around because they're afraid the other guy might have one, and then they might shop. His economist might shockingly be more useful than the ones they've met. So we always have a somewhat tense relationship with our corporate employers who aren't sure we're worth the money, right? But they'll keep you around, so your economists are telling you, look, this is a terrible model. You're loaning more and more money to people who have a less and less ability to pay it back and are more and more desperate for the money, right? Old bankers joke, never give a loan to any man who needs it. A good client is someone who doesn't need the money. They already have lots of money. Why is that a good client? They're going to pay you back, right? The bad client is somebody who desperately needs the money, because whoever needs the money today needs the money tomorrow, and they need the money next week, and they need the money next year. And when you need to be paid back, they're going to tell you the same story. Geez, I need some money. Geez, I need some money. Geez, I need some money. You want to be paid back in full, on time, with interest, right? So the world economy is dependent on an American consumer. American business is dependent on an American consumer. The sustained political delusion of mass prosperity, of social mobility, and of social cohesion here requires everyone to feel like they can consume more and or better than their parents. So it's the founding myth, it's the social glue, it's the expectation. It's the expectation in part because between 1880 and 1970, right, real wages went up for the average American every single decade, including the Great Depression. So in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910, so this is the story of America. This pulled people moving here from all over the world, making other sacrifices, giving up other dreams. This was the social cohesion, and it probably reaches its apex form in the possibility of an average person to own a home, right? Unheard of for lower class income class folks historically, before the 1940s and 50s, unheard of in large parts of the rest of the world, where there is no credit market. The credit market allows the middle class person to buy a house. The house is also the only asset that the average American has. And here I'm going to talk about this a little longer because you're not used to hearing this way. The house, the private residence, real estate, is the only significant asset that the average middle class family has. So if you look at the total asset wealth of the United States, only about 25% of it is housing. That's all the housing, right? As we sit and chat with each other, best estimates from the Federal Reserve are that all the residential housing in the entire country is worth about $18 trillion, right? And that's going to form a little bit less than 25% of the total wealth we have. However, the house, whatever you own of your house for the middle class average American, is your only real wealth, right? So if the average household has a net worth of about $65,000, $40,000 of it is going to be what they own of their home. Right, that's average, and obviously by income group and region, there are huge differentials here. When you make an average, there's always a risk. So I tend to speak in averages, so I'll give you my disclaimer. The average family also has 1.3 kids. Hopefully you don't know anyone with 1.3 kids, and if you do, call the police, right? Because that 0.3 child is problematic. So sometimes averages have their problems. They don't necessarily represent underlying realities perfectly, right? But I'm going to speak in averages. It's the data that I play with. It's the water I swim with. So we see the situation here of increasing pressure. You have to loan to the American consumer. We need the American consumer. The wages are flat. Wages are ultimately the only way they can pay for things, including pay back debt. They're kind of moving toward being tapped out on their home, non-home borrowing. So they're tapped out on their credit cards or close to it, tapped out on their auto loans or close to it, right? Average auto loan in the United States from the 1970s, where the business gets big, starts out at 12 months. By the boom here in 2006, average auto loan in the United States, 60 months. Car is worthless by the end of 60 months. There's no point in foreclosing it, right? When you build the models, when you talk to the corporate decision makers, you don't have a real morality-rich conversation, yes? You have a probability-rich conversation about profits and risk-adjusted returns. So I'm used to that language. Sometimes folks find it offensive, but I'm trying to give you an idea of how the system operates. Not necessarily how it should or we'd all like to see it operate. Yep, so you have this crest in debt, but you have an increasingly indebted group of people who don't have the means to pay for it. What do you do? Particularly, what do you do in the long shadow of the tech wreck and the global recession, 2000-2001? So now we have an economic turndown. The great fear from the policy analysts and from the politicians and from the experts is that this will be the big recession in which a large portion of the middle class falls off a cliff. Right? I was once canned unceremoniously from a consulting gig with a very famous person in the Democratic Party, whose name I won't share with you, for reasons of respect and my desire to have the ability to go back to Washington for consulting jobs. But the argument we made at that point was, don't try to push the economy back up in the same way that you have before. It won't work. It'll make the problem worse. Somebody has to message the general public and tell them that large segments of the general public in the United States are not actually middle class. They're the artists formerly known as middle class. And if we want to have a middle class, we have to make a middle class. Simply declaring people middle class, which they love to hear, and people love as a self-image, is fucking worthless, right? It's like telling someone they've been educated at the end of their online university experience, right? You can give them a certificate, it costs about 35 cents, and you can tell them that they're educated, and some of them might be, despite your best efforts, but it's not really a substitute for what they were supposed to get, right? It's tofurkey from someone who's not a vegan. They wanted a turkey sandwich and they got something else, right? You can argue whether it's good or bad or better for the planet and all the other stuff, but they thought they ordered this one thing. That's what they thought they were going to get. Many of them think it's their birthright. They're eating something else, and there's only so much hot sauce and spin you can use to hide it, right? So the argument was, let's not try to push back. Of course, that was lost, not just because I was fired. I was nowhere near important enough. Unimportant graduate student doing marginally interesting technical research, but was with a group that got cleared out for making the joke about the artist formerly known as middle class. It was not appreciated. I liked it. Obviously, I'm still repeating it. Right? I've been fired twice for one-liners, which I now use all the time. I think they're pretty good. So that one, the artist formerly known as middle class, and you'll see it's all over the TV and the documentary stuff I've done. And the other two would be that the ownership society is what we got when we were promised an ownership society. That's my story of housing. And that my story of the service economy is that it's a servant economy. So you were promised an ownership society, but you got an ownership society. And you were promised a service economy, but most of the public will eventually realize it's a servant economy, and they'll realize that the hard way because they're servants, right? And that's what happens when you have stagnant wages and you keep growing the debt. Housing is the breath of fresh air. So in response to the serious economic crisis in 2000, 2001, the federal government tried to rehabilitate the economy. This was a bipartisan effort, to be fair. So both parties worked on this more or less evenly. Republicans were a bit in the lead, and the financial authorities at the Federal Reserve and the Treasuries do skew a little to the right of the standard Democratic Party folks, even when they're appointed by the Democratic Party folks. But it was bipartisan, and the effort was, let's make it so cheap and so easy to borrow that we can borrow to bridge to economic growth. And the problem is we never got back to the economic growth. What we got is addicted to borrowing more and making more credit available on looser terms. So now you have an economy that's not growing wages for the majority of people who are already indebted, and you become increasingly reliant for economic growth and to put opportunity in front of these folks on more and more borrowing at lower and lower rates. What does this require? This requires deregulation and heavy financial engineering, and income Wall Street financial engineers, right? They're coming in, though, to solve a social problem. Not because they give a shit about solving anyone's problems or giving anyone their fucking dream home. That never even comes up. But you're trying to figure out a way to insert yourself between what the public needs and what it has, so you can take from the public and make your money. And you're just inserting yourself into every transaction you can insert yourself into, right? So no goodwill here, but no ill will. You're trying to insert yourself into every transaction, right? Give a guy a hammer and the whole world looks like a nail. So the more you need to borrow, the more they can insert into the deal, they take a cut of the action. So the American public has had stagnant wages for 30 years. They're borrowing more, they need to borrow more, we need them to borrow and spend more to keep the economy going, but there's no real job growth. Actually, there's job contraction, and there's no wage growth to do it. So what are we going to do? We're going to let them borrow more and more money at cheaper and cheaper rates. That's going to require complex financial engineering to do. We're going to have to find a creditor class. That's going to be the wealthy and non-U.S. nationals. And we're going to have to find a way to get someone to keep lending. And the way they do it is by turning the average person's home into a speculative financial instrument. So the home that you think of as a home, that your policies, your actions are home, are actually a tail, or maybe they're the dog, but they're wagged by the tail of the international appetite to invest in mortgages. Right? So the governments drive interest rates down to allow borrow and spend to push up the economy. This makes the return on safe investments very low. So your pension fund, your insurance company, your international investor needs to find a way to make money, higher money than they can get with the low interest rates. And at the same time, the public's broke and we need them to buy. How do you do this? You engineer financial products. You turn the largest middle class, the only and largest middle class asset class into an international speculative asset. That's the mortgage, right? You do that by changing the rules of banking, changing how mortgages are originated, how they're owned, and who they're sold to, right? You've heard a version of this story, mostly from the right, which says greedy people borrow lots of money. Right? This may be true, not interesting. I'm not a moralist, right? I chose economics. At least for the last 250 years, anyone who's an economist tells you they're a moral authority, probably you should be suspicious, right? This field doesn't particularly attract or reward people who want to discuss the moral basis of decision making. That's not our strength as a field. It's except we have any strength, that ain't one of them, right? So we're there to model out the behavior, do statistics, a range of things that I think are important, but morality expertise, not something this field can much claim. The general public has always wanted to borrow money, and low-income people have always wanted to borrow money. That's why there's a security guard at every bank. And for time immemorial, they came in, they said, I have this great idea, I want to start a business, I want to buy a house, I want a car, and they said, fuck you. And if you don't leave in 35 minutes, we have police, that's what the gates are for, get out. Right? Because you don't loan money based on people who need money in a for-profit financial system, you loan money based on your highest risk-adjusted expected return. Right? It doesn't matter what interest rate they'll pay. It doesn't matter if they're nice or if they're from a historically marginalized group or anything like that. That's not in your loan book, right? Your loan book is, will I get paid back on time, in full, and can I get an interest rate that makes me a reasonable profit? That's it. That's the decision maker. You might do a little stuff for your TV ads or some pro bono to call down your tax liability, or message if you had a lawsuit or something recently. But that's all basically image consulting. Your PR people take care of it. It's not in the loan book, right? That's not what you do. So something changed on the lender side to make the lenders willing to do it. And the quick and dirty, because we may not have the attention span and we certainly don't have the time to go through all the interstices, the accumulation of 25 years of bank deregulation changed the way banks looked at the borrowers, particularly on houses. Houses are collateral. You can seize that collateral. So you're not just betting on the person's good faith or wages. By 2001, sophisticated modelers and economists were telling the banks that was a disaster. That was a long walk off a short pier. You only want to loan to the public if you have a high rate of return, you can action the asset in some way, pull it back. And even if you can't pull it back, you just have to credibly convince them you can pull it back. You don't actually have to pull it back. It's like exporting jobs. I can get you to take a wage concession or a benefits concession as long as you believe I might outsource your job. I don't actually have to do it. I just have to do it enough that you're scared, right? Same with a house. I get you to pay as long as I have a demonstration effect of a lot of people crying and being upset that they got chucked out of their house. I'm not going to actually grab all the houses, and that wouldn't be profitable anyway. That has to be a credible threat, right? That's the idea. So they find a way to sell more things to the public, give them more to borrow, by allowing them to basically borrow out the accumulated middle-class wealth that's represented in houses. So they give more loans to more people on looser terms with less conditions, right? Why would banks do this? Doesn't make much sense. They always said no, and the way they did it is because it's not their money. It's the old rule. People are always looser if it's OPM, other people's money. And so the banking model shifts from originate to own, right? Originate to own means I make you the loan, a classic home mortgage, plain vanilla, 30-year fixed mortgage, right? I'm now entering into a relationship with you, if I'm your banker, much longer than the average American marriage. Very few American marriages last 30 years now. I got a more intimate, long-term relationship with you than your wife or your husband. Whatever happens to you for the next 30 years, I'm on the hook too. That is pretty scary. I might do a little work to see how likely you are to pay me back. I might keep an eye on you. I might want to know something about you. That might entail racial discrimination. It might entail gender discrimination. It might entail lifestyle or, sexual orientation discrimination. It has negatives, but I'm going to want to know who the person is. I'm going to care. That's originate to own, long-term relationship. With the deregulation and the effort to loan more and more to a public that looks less and less likely to pay it back, what do? You move from originate to own to what we call originate to distribute, right? Now I make a loan to somebody. I make a little money for making the loan. I service the loan. I pester you. I'm still the one who sends you a mail if you miss your mortgage payment or to tell you when it's coming. You call me with your questions, but I'm going to sell this loan as fast as I can to someone else. So I can use the same 300 grand I loaned you for your house, but I'm going to loan it to you, do the paperwork, and sell it to someone else for $298,000. The faster, the better. At the peak of this industry, 2006, early 2007, people were targeting a 30-day hold period. They wanted these things packaged and out the door within a calendar month, sometimes faster. So you make the mortgage and then whack, bundle it and get rid of it. So you don't own it. You don't have the 30-year relationship. This isn't a marriage anymore. It's a one-night stand. Right? Or maybe it's a summer fling. It's 2 weeks. This is not a marriage. Right? This is short, fast, and dirty. And you don't really care. Right? What's their last name? Who knows? And who cares? It'll never be mine. Right? Boom. In, out. And you try to get this money moving through as fast as you can. A whole constellation of little firms and sometimes larger firms grows up to fill this niche, sometimes referred to as a shadow banking industry. So now you have a business. We found a way to loan to a group of people who don't have the money to be a good bet generally, because we can collateralize the house. We're going to do this on two conditions. We have to believe we can seize the house. The laws are right to seize the house. It's doable in a reasonably efficient, effective time frame, and that the house price will basically either rise or at least flat. You're only interested in being able to seize the house if the person doesn't pay, if you can get at least what you're owed. So you have to make an assumption that you can action the house in a fairly reasonable, low-cost way. You can take it back if you have to, and that the homes will hold their value. And everyone looks at the market, and they see the market telling them this is a good idea. Because what's happening is more and more and more and more and more loans are being made, which push up the price of the houses. If you're willing to loan more money to more people under more widely variant circumstances, you have more money chasing the same amount of housing. So eventually it pulls new housing in, new housing is built, but more than anything, it bids up the price of housing. So if you're sitting there trying to decide where to loan, you're saying, this is magical. We can loan to a public that can't afford it on their wages. We can do it with financial engineering. We can control our risk through the new financial products. If worse comes to worse, we'll action the house. We'll repossess it. We shouldn't have to, and who cares? Because we won't have to. The house is increasing in value. If the person gets in trouble, they'll just refinance the house and take some of the money, right? Or if worse comes to worse, I'll grab the house and it'll be flat to rising and dying. So the guy owes me 200 grand, hits the wall 3 months later, it's a mess, but if he hits the wall 3 years later and he's paid me back, it'll be interest only up front. I'll take the house and I'll sell it for as much or more. It's okay, right? This will be okay. So the money starts flowing in, but it's compensating for all kinds of other things in the economy. So you get this refinancing boom, what's called mortgage equity withdrawal refinancing, right? To give you an idea of how big this was, in 2005, 2006, Americans withdrew more value from their homes than the total increase in all wages and all salaries in the US economy. Stop and think about that. That means that going more into debt on your house is putting more money in the average family's pocket in 2 calendar years in a $15 trillion economy, the largest single national economy in the world still, that all increases in salaries and all increases in wages. That meant that America's homes and home finance became the raise they didn't get, the boss they couldn't ask for a loan, and the savings they hadn't done. That's why you get a macroeconomic dependence on the housing sector, which shouldn't have been and isn't intrinsically that important. But what it is a way to borrow a lot of money really cheap. And at the same time, because there's so much money in there now chasing up the price of houses, it gives you another capability. It makes you feel wealthy. You're not left behind. You're not the artist formerly known as middle class. You're now a person who can get a big check from the bank, who can get granite countertops and a new stove and a bigger house. Average square footage in America, 1998, 1,900 square feet. Okay? 2006, 2,500 square feet. Average size of the American family, unchanged. So we didn't have some boom where lots of people had tons of kids, then we would expect a house size to increase, right? We have no positive demographic trend. We don't have a large number of young people who are going to start houses. We don't have a family size increase, but we have nicer, newer stuff in that house. We have a bigger house. We have a lot more housing. Why? Because it becomes very profitable to loan money to people, and you get a disconnect between whether they can pay it back and whether the loan will be made. And it permeates everything, right? So it's a job for some people at the 6,000 new Lowe's and Home Depots. It's a job for someone else at the new restaurants sprouting up, because people feel wealthier. One of the first things they do is use the restaurants, right? It's new retail square footage. It's parents sending their kids to school, or in some cases graduate school, by borrowing cheap against their house, right? So it's a boom that's big enough, right? So U.S. total housing debt, $5.5 trillion in 2001. U.S. total housing debt in 2007, $10 trillion, doubles in 5 years. So in 5-year periods, from 2001 to 2006, we add as much housing debt as we had added in the previous 100 years. Right? So you get an idea of something spinning out. It's paying your salary, it's paying for school, it's paying for retirement. You get a whole generation of people who are going to retire on the appreciation of their home. You get a whole generation of middle-class people whose investments got wiped out in 2000, 2001 in the tech wreck. They felt poor, they know their wages haven't gone up, they don't have enough for retirement, they're scared about it, they're worried about medical costs, and all of a sudden, eureka, through the magic of debt and speculation, they get cash flow from this house, from mortgage equity withdrawal, from borrowing, right? And they get the sense of being rich. Their $250,000 house is a $500,000 house. And they can talk to 9 out of 10 experts, or listen to 20 out of 21 TV shows, and learn that if it's $500,000 today, that house will be $600,000 in 2 years. The money they didn't save, the pension they didn't get, whatever it is, that was there, right? And if you were one of those weirdos, right? And it's always a personality thing as much as an intellectual thing. We're going to go out there and sit on the television and say you didn't think so. There wasn't a very comfortable place for you, right? So this became important enough to enough people that a voice in the woods, and there were hundreds or thousands of people screaming this wasn't going to go well too, wasn't much listened to. And I'll give you the last reason I think that is too, and then I'll give you the Q&A here. And the reason is, it's very easy to convince someone of something they're desperate to believe. And it's very easy to hide something from someone, just psychiatrically, that they're desperate not to see, right? And maybe the best little short version of this is an old movie my father loved, so I used to watch it as a kid. It was Young Frankenstein, There's a great scene in the movie where Frankenstein, or Frankenstein, if you've ever seen the movie, will correct Billy's other pronunciation. He encounters Igor, not Igor, who has a bit of a hump on his back, as the character's supposed to. And he tells him, look, I'm a talented surgeon, I can do something for you with that hump. And he turns to him and he says, what hump? And the old joke we had, a few of us, economists who would do the, I don't really know why we did it, the repetition compulsion. You'd go on the TV and you'd tell them it's a disaster, it's a disaster, it's a disaster, and whatever. There were a lot of us, a bunch of us, but the old joke was what hump? It would always be the question you'd get, right? Which is what hump? First of all, maybe this can't last. Why shit on it? Let them enjoy it while it's there. Right? And that was more or less the attitude in a sort of witty moment expressed by the CEO of Citibank. Right? He said, look, we know this song will end in tears, but until the music stops, we dance. This game is musical chairs. When the music's on, you dance.
Margin call.
Yeah, and lots of people have made it a big thing. What I'd like to tell you, though, is this is a $6 trillion global event. You're not going to pick out a few bad apples. There isn't some guy in some place who did this because he's evil, right? Or some lady in some firm who did this. There were firms who made more money and less. There were firms that are more responsible and less. There's lots of responsibility to go around. But you had collusion from the general public, collusion from the politicians, excitement from the financial firms, and it was basically a symptom of an underlying disease. And that disease is, it costs a lot more to be middle class in the United States than a middle class job can pay for it. And until that disconnect is somehow dealt with, you're going to have a series of weird phenomena when people attempt to find the magic bullet, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that gets them back to where they think they have to be, and they ought to be, and they deserve to be, and they were born to be. And that, as that drifts away from where they are, you're going to get all kinds of bizarre mechanisms. One, which blew up in 2008, was the finance. And the last example I'll give you of that is, I don't believe, and then I go around, that the public is angry at the banks for loaning them all that money. I think the public is angry at the banks because they stopped loaning them money. And I think all kinds of progressives think that they're angry at the banks for loaning them that money. And while I understand that, I don't think it's true. I think they're angry that the unsustainable bubble stopped. Because getting that access to that credit was what paid the bills. It's what bought you a new car and a better house, and you sure as shit aren't getting a raise at your job. So as we sit here, for the last 4 years, real wages have gone down, benefit packages have gone down. So what we've actually seen is less debt, which is good news, and the public is vomiting up, having overeaten some of the debt there, vomiting up, regurgitating some of the debt. We actually use the term debt regurgitation. And it's a good image. Maybe not pleasant for lunch, but it's a good image. It tells the story. So there's some debt regurgitation, but the wages continue to go down. And that was the report that nobody paid attention to last week, which was year over year, March 2011 to March 2012, we saw another 1% aggregate decline in real hourly wages. Right? So the bottom line is the things that created this crisis are very much still there. All that happened is we had a giant bubble and then it exploded as one very important, very large, very global coping mechanism rose to prominence, slammed into a wall, and rather unceremoniously blew up. And that's where we are now. And the government programs we've had for this are mostly window dressing and public relations, with some help for some folks, but they're daily and several dollars short so far. And that remains the $64,000 question going into the 2012 cycle. Will this matter? And the only thing I think both parties agree on is neither political party wants this to be talked about too much. They might get a little close to it because the Republicans have a strategy about the economy not recovering enough, and the Obama strategy group wants to talk about economic recovery, so we might get closer to it than we do usually, but nobody wants to talk about this still. I don't mean nobody. Obviously, general public, people affected want to talk about it. I mean, in the decision-making circles, this remains a topic slightly less popular than the discussion of your recent bowel movement. It will not get you invited again, and you will not be seen as classy or appropriate if you bring it up. That being said, shit happens. And I'll leave it to you for the Q&A for the rest of our time. Well done. Thank you. Sure.
I'm still a little unclear. So the four major contributing factors were no increase in wages,
Stagnant real wages,
rising
education costs, rising housing costs, and rising indebtedness.
Oh, okay.
If you email me, I can email you a presentation that goes through with lots of slides and all the rest, but this didn't seem like the best venue for a lengthy PowerPoint.
So deregulation was part of it, but not...
Yeah, well, deregulation is a part of what happened to wage stagnation. It's a part of what happened to growing indebtedness, right? It's part of what happened to the university costs. Medical costs and education costs are actually correlated in a number of ways. Because part of what pushes up the cost for students is a cost of student health insurance, and staff health insurance. It's not the only, but it actually factors in a weird way to higher education costs in a way that do. And also changing loan structures. And there's all kinds of cultural and political stuff, which is not my focus. It's hugely important, at least as important as the economics. The economics is what I think I can make a rational claim I would know better than the other folks you'd get in here. But the cultural things, growing cultural acceptance of debt, changing attitudes, especially with younger people. I mean, younger Americans have been taught, which is not altogether unreasonable, different from their parents, that you borrow to get it, or you just don't get it. If you're older, you think, well, I will save and I will eventually be able to afford it and get it. That might have made sense given the U.S. economy where you grew up. If you're a younger person in the United States, particularly from a not super affluent family, you may reasonably believe I either buy it when I can't afford it or I never get it at all. And so you make a different decision, right? Your decision is, do I want it? Then I get it by whatever means necessary. Or can I go without it? Then it's okay, and I run the risk of not getting it. But the idea that you're going to wait and save money with a stable job and a growing income, a lot of younger people don't believe that. And not because they're crazy or short-term minded, there may be some of that, but it's because that hasn't been the world they live in. Right? I mean, as we sit and chat going into the summer, which may itself be interesting, the unemployment rate for American teenagers, very high. 22% for whites, 30.5% for Hispanics, and 41% for blacks. Those are the developing country social instability indicators. I've done consulting for the United Nations projects, and we would look for youth male unemployment above 20%. That's usually a signal of potential for trouble, right? Folks with nothing to do find things for themselves to do, which aren't always socially optimal.
Occupy.
You'll get some of that, right? You'll get some of that in the camp, in the tent city. But you won't know if those people are in the tent city for the food and the medicine, or if they're in the tent city for the cause. Which isn't necessarily the end of the world. Maybe it doesn't matter why you came there. But it depends on who you get in there. And then, at least in New York City, there have been some very unfortunate incidents around that. You know, where the whole movement, probably even nationally, gets tarred unfairly with a brush because you got 25 people in there who just wanted a free place to go. And who might abscond with some of the property of the church or the group, right? So, plus, there's definitely a tailwind and a headwind there.
Well, we had people in New Paltz who started out there for a place to be, and then by the end, when we were evicted, they were there for the cause.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I mean. It may not matter why they show up, right? But it's worth thinking about that. It's a vindication of some of the ideas as well as the risk, right? Because part of what an economy functioning well does is not leave vast swaths of young people desperate, clueless, and adrift. On some very basic level, that's not an indicator of success, right? I mean, on some level, a society has some quasi-parenting responsibility, right? What would you think of parents who are like, where are your kids? Like, I don't know, hopefully they're having a good time, they're out there somewhere. Around this time of day, they get hungry, so I assume they're looking for food, right? Like, they're not going to put you on a sitcom with those parenting skills. And the economy should be giving people things to do other than see where they can sleep for free and get celery sticks and peanut butter. Even though it may have a good result in the end, right?
I was wondering, this might be a little bit out of your scope, if you can answer or not, but I was wondering, economically, have you ever imagined, is there a way to not have mortgages? Some other economic structure, some other way to basically not have this loan shark agreement between a bank and a person, which is basically, in my estimation, exploitative.
Okay, well, most of the world, most of the time, there have been no mortgages. So the normal state of economic history in most of the world is no mortgages, or very short-term expensive mortgages. So for instance, the country where I have relatives, so I know a little better the model. You take the German system, right? You need to put down 30% to buy a house, period. And you're not going to get a mortgage for more than 15 years unless you never messed up a payment for anything ever, including like your light bill or your gas bill. The reason we have mortgages was to try to make home ownership, with the attendant political conservatism that we thought would come along with it, and the shared prosperity. So mortgages are an equalizer attempt, right? When you borrow money, all it does is it amplifies your underlying economic bet, right? So we even call it leverage, levers up the bet. If you make a good bet, you'll make more money. If you make a bad bet, you'll lose more money, right? Here's the problem we have. We could get rid of mortgages for sure in the United States. We may be moving in that direction long term anyway, because of creditworthiness and the solidity of the American middle class are very much open to question, right? But we could move toward that, but all that would mean is our housing, the percentage of society that owns houses would tank. So we already see rentals growing fast, homeownership's tanking. So for people under 35, some of our demographics in the room, actually it's fell by 15% since the start of the recession. It's actually tanking. The rental market's way up, homeownership's way down. Before we had Fannie Mae, and then later was the big one, we had about 21% homeownership in the United States going into the Great Depression. It was an investment in shared prosperity of building a middle class that built the mortgage system, right? Now we peaked out at almost 70% homeownership, right? And we've been tanking ever since. So we're all the way back down into the 60s. From being in the high 60s, we're back down to low 60s. We could, but here's the problem. If we just do that in a vacuum, all you have is the vast majority of people become tenants. And they become tenants in America with almost no tenant laws, with a few exceptions in New York City, even where they've been very watered down. But you'd have a society of tenants with no tenants' rights, right? So mortgages allow homeownership. That being said, you can have utility mortgages, which I think is what you might be kind of leaning toward, or you can have private for-profit mortgage. In other words, you can have heavily subsidized mortgages, we do, that aren't particularly profitable, that are basically utility, right? So you come in, you show, it's not rocket science. You show what you've earned, you show what you own, what you've saved, you save 10 to 20%, you get a low, long-term, cheap mortgage, and it's a way to subsidize people being homeless, right? We moved away from that to a kind of Wild West, deregulated international financial asset mortgage market, and probably somewhere in between there, no mortgages make sense. The other thing is part of the reason we have this mortgage problem is we have no renters' rights, so people are desperate not to be renters because they're jerked around and ripped off and it's unstable and all the rest of it. And the other reason is we have no investment in public affordable housing whatsoever. Do you want to live okay for most Americans in a lot of geographies? You either rent a luxurious place or you buy one. And people might be a lot less interested in this expensive long-term risk if they had alternatives, you know, affordable, decent public housing might be one of them, or real renters' rights, so that as a renter you weren't more or less solely subject to the whims of your private landlord or property management firm. Those would change the contours, but mortgages were an attempt to make a middle class with property ownership, with all the attendant benefits and costs that come with that process.
Could you speak a little bit about the matter of the creation of money and how the availability of all this money to lend actually comes into being?
Sure. Well, we have a global financial deregulation, so banks can suck up deposits, which they do, in any of many localities, and then spit out loans in other ones. In other words, if you have a high savings rate in industrial Northeast Asia, which you do, of approximately 30%, right? Then you have these banks stuck with hundreds of billions of dollars, but they don't know how to lend. If you're a bank, you want to pull in money as cheap as possible. You don't want to pay much for the money you get, and you want to lend it out for as much as possible with the proviso that, of course, you want to be paid back in full on time. If you deregulate globally, then you can move savings around the world. Right? In the peak of the U.S. bubble, 05, 06, 07, we were borrowing 65 cents on the available dollar around the world. So 65 cents, a open dollars, deposited in global accounts, was coming here and being lent to American consumers. So part of what happened is we had global financial deregulation that allowed more of the world's money to fly around international borders, and a lot of it came here. The other banking system we've had, which we have had since 1913, is called fractional reserve banking. That comes in with the Federal Reserve. Lots of people hate the Federal Reserve. It's a famous boogeyman in all this. It is worthwhile to understand we had the Federal Reserve because we had serious, wrenching, massive financial crisis every 5 to 7 years before the Federal Reserve. When we left us to the totally deregulated free markets and to more or less J.P. Morgan, who was in charge of this, James Pierpont Morgan. The House of Morgan was the lender of last resort and fought against the Federal Reserve because they didn't want to lose that to a federal regulator. So before we had a regulator, we had different states printing their own money, which was often worthless. You didn't know if your money would be accepted across state lines. People had to carry medals because so much of the money was false, right? So if you actually take out a dollar bill in your pocket, or any denomination, 1, 5, 10, 50, whatever, 20, 100, right? You'll see it's Federal Reserve. No, the Federal Reserve standardized this. So while the Federal Reserve certainly leaves something to be desired, the absence of the Federal Reserve, a little bit like the absence of the mortgage market, makes sense as an angry response to a feeling of betrayal and misadventure and some real asleep at the wheel time by a regulator. All well understood. However, this abolished the Federal Reserve. I call it the Ron Paul story, right? And having worked with some people who are the money guys for Ron Paul and met and talked to them, smart and interesting guys from the Von Mises Institute, I'm not sure that's the solution that you should be most comfortable with. So what the Federal Reserve is doing here is overseeing fractional reserve banking. What fractional reserve banking is, the Federal Reserve sets a limit on how much of every deposit you can lend out, right? So it's approximately 10% now. So if I come in and deposit, I move to Rhinebeck tomorrow, and I deposit a check, $1,000, right? The bank has a right to loan out $900 of that. They give me the credit for $1,000, then they go to you, and they loan you $900, contingent on you opening an account there, which all the banks require. You then open up an account, you deposit the $900. They then take $810 of that and loan it to him. So the same money is being churned lots of times, called fractional reserve banking. All modern banks are faith-based initiatives.
So it's
If-
like a Ponzi.
It's not a Ponzi scheme. It's not illegal, right? Charles Ponzi sold stamps that didn't actually have the backing to return the letters from Italy, right? In fairness to Charles Ponzi, he had a decent idea. He got, but he began selling products he didn't actually own, right? What this is an attempt to have less money facilitate more transactions in the economy, right?
If you keep adding up the amount of money that's lent out on the initial
Yeah, it's a geometric approximation.
you end to get that there's a debt of $10,000 for every $1,000.
That would be a liability. I mean, the way
liability.
Yeah, the way bank balance sheets work, you have a $10,000 total liability, a $10,000 total asset. They cross on a zero net, right? But if I did the $1,000 standard rules, and the bank chose to lend the money out, the bank can choose at any time to say no. The public can choose at any time to be unwilling to borrow. Businesses can be unwilling to borrow. But if everything is called fully lent out, zero excess reserves in the system, my $1,000 deposit at the Rhinebeck, I don't know the names of local banks, whatever, Rhinebeck Savings and Trust will produce $10,000 expansion in the money supply here. In the greater Rhinebeck metro area, Rhinebeck SMA, statistical metropolitan area. I don't know how you define it.
It's a pyramid scheme, basically.
It's not necessarily a pyramid scheme. As long as people keep the faith, it goes on. I think the faith-based initiative, I don't want to give anyone a hard time or offend anyone's beliefs. I think the faith-based initiative thing works. It's a little bit like God. I'm not a religious person, and I don't want to offend anyone, but God's there so long as you believe God's there. If you need to meet him in the hallway, it might be tough.
The pyramid scheme is a faith-based initiative. As long as people believe that it's going to keep on coming in the future, it keeps going. And then at a certain point, there's a panic, and that's the end. Which seems like it's the same thing here. As long as people believe that this debt is going to be recovered.
If everyone pulls their money out at once. There are safeguards, right? So you have to keep 10% of all the deposit value in what's called vault cash or access account at the Federal Reserve. So if you have a $100 million book of business, we know that you have to have $1 million in there at all times in cash, right? They also have limits on your accounts on how much you can pull out at one time or one day. Some of you may have encountered this. You go someplace and you try to take out more than $500 or whatever your limit is, right? And it tells you, nope, you exceeded your limit.
At the point where everybody feels
They'll trigger it. If you look,
going to be able to pay this back. That seems to be what's happening.
we could have a run on the bank. There was real fear at Bank of America that there would be a run on the bank in 2008 and again once in 2009. If you look closely at your banking contract that you sign with them, they have the right to randomly deny you access to your money for 136 hours by declaring the initial processing need. They also have a standby loan from the Federal Reserve. They also have standby loans from other banks. And they can borrow limitlessly from the Federal Reserve, in an emergency situation.
Well, they're getting that now, though, right? From the
Those are
discount
different.
window?
The discount window is slightly different. This is the Fed funds and overnight window, but yes, there are multiple lending facilities. They don't pay nothing, but they pay very low, 1/4 of 1% right now, for prime borrowers with access to the discount window.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, what, $5 trillion that's been lent out through the discount window? Is that the number?
The discount window is revolving, so you get very different numbers if you add up the sum total of every visit. Average duration of a loan there is 270 days. They turn over pretty quickly. It's about half a year, not even half a year, 3/4 of a year. So they're short. It depends if you add them all up or if you take what's outstanding at any given time, right?
Yeah.
But lots of access was given.
But that's what's propping the banks up now, right? Not the TARP program.
I think we should